When the final tally was made by the state investigators, who arrived nearly a week late, they found irrefutable evidence of 23 armed men entering that dense, sprawling thicket in Kaufman County. All were members of a highly organized, heavily equipped posse led by a local lawman of notorious persistence. Less than 24 hours later, no living member of that pursuit returned to the county seat. The records speak in coded language of a catastrophic sudden reversal of fortune, a complete and total operational failure. But the central, unnerving paradox remains embedded in the fragile documents of the time. How does a single, unarmed individual, hunted and desperately exposed, manage to eliminate an entire force designed explicitly for capture and containment within the brutal confines of a single summer day? This was not a simple flight from justice. It was not a matter of speed or endurance, though both factors were crucial to the final outcome. This event was a tactical elimination, documented in fragmented local archives, obscure coroner's reports, and heavily censored judicial files dating back to the late summer of 1878. It was something the nascent state government of Texas desperately attempted to obscure, later attributing the deaths vaguely to natural disasters, misadventure, or even marauding wildlife. Yet, the forensic analysis conducted much later by independent historical researchers, piecing together the scattered original documents, told a distinctly different, deeply disturbing story. A story of a calculated, precise, and utterly successful stand of resistance. We must first establish the context, the heavy, unforgiving stage upon which this confrontation was set. The year was 1878. The location, East Texas, specifically the remote, humid bottomlands stretching along the Trinity River, weaving through what was then Kaufman County. The Reconstruction era had officially concluded, but the machinery of economic and social control remained terrifyingly effective. This was a territory where the establishment of law often served less as an instrument of equitable justice and more as a brutal enforcement mechanism designed to maintain the new status quo of debt bondage and tenant farming dependencies. The systems in place required relentless coercion, and local deputies, often equipped with nearly unlimited jurisdictional power, were the final arbiters of that force. The environment itself was a character in this drama. The dense forests of hardwood and pine gave way abruptly to suffocating tracts of bog and river delta, a maze of cypress knees, stagnant water, and tangled undergrowth. The August heat was not just uncomfortable, it was a tangible, aggressive weight, clinging to the air and draining the strength from any man not born and conditioned to its crushing humidity. For the pursuers, accustomed to open-range riding and quick action, the bottomlands represented a hostile world, a natural fortress where every shadow might conceal a hazard. The focus of this immediate, violent pursuit was a man documented only sparsely in the local plantation records and Deputy Thorne's official journals, usually listed by the impersonal designation of E.L. The extant records, often stained and partially destroyed, indicate approximately 14 years spent navigating the harshest realities of enforced labor systems across 3 different counties, interspersed with multiple documented attempts at self-emancipation. E.L. was not, according to any existing document, a trained soldier or a political radical. He was, fundamentally, a survivor who had learned the intricate, deadly language of the wilderness through painful necessity and the singular focus of escaping absolute control. His reputation among those who ran the system was one of unusual physical endurance and unnerving familiarity with the terrain, a man who could, and often did, disappear entirely into the landscape. Prior to the event, E.L. had been recaptured 3 times. Each recapture resulted in severe consequences, reinforcing his deep knowledge of the punitive systems he sought to evade. This cycle of flight and recapture hardened not just his body, but his tactical mindset. He understood the protocols, the timings, the weaknesses, and, most importantly, the arrogance of the men who hunted him. He knew that the pursuit, driven by institutional confidence, would always follow the path of least resistance, until that path became impossibly dangerous. The event that triggered the 24-hour pursuit, the moment of absolute rupture, occurred on the morning of August 7th. According to a heavily edited affidavit later filed by a farmhand employed by the Thorne family, Deputy Thorne confronted E.L. near the edge of the property line, intending a routine recapture over a minor infraction related to accumulated debt. The details of the initial confrontation are sparse and conflicting, but the outcome was immediate and unprecedented. E.L. vanished into the dense thicket adjacent to the river bottom, moving with speed and purpose. This time, however, the deputy noted something unusual. E.L. had left behind a deliberate trail, not of panic, but of calculated provocation. A snapped sapling here, a clear indentation there. It was a conscious invitation to follow him directly into the most treacherous section of the territory. It was the moment E.L. transitioned from a hunted fugitive into a calculated combatant on his own terms. Deputy Thorne, the leader of the posse, was a man whose confidence was rooted in systemic power and sheer numbers. The records describe him as a veteran of the Confederate cavalry, accustomed to swift, decisive, and overwhelming application of force. He assembled his posse quickly. 22 men, a mix of deputies, experienced trackers, and well-armed volunteers. They were mounted on fresh horses and carried modern rifles and sidearms. They expected the chase to last perhaps half a day, ending predictably in a swift capture and a forceful lesson in obedience. Why, then, did E.L., and facing an overwhelming force of 24 armed, mounted, and determined men, choose confrontation over continued flight west? What specific geographical and tactical knowledge did he possess that caused the most experienced trackers among Thorne's posse to hesitate almost immediately upon crossing the boundary into the deep woods? And why, when the bodies of the pursuers were eventually recovered days later, were there no clear conventional exit wounds or evidence of close-range conventional combat, only signs of extreme tactical confusion and environmental failure? These are the open loops, the historical mysteries that define the narrative. The pursuit began precisely at 10:45 a.m. The initial assessment was pure condescension. Thorne had famously stated, according to one witness affidavit, that the man is desperate, but the woods are not so big that 23 rifles cannot find a corner to catch him. The posse moved into the bottomland, their confidence still high, the sun baking the clearing behind them. The plan was simple. The group would spread out, forming a wide semicircular sweep that would push E.L. toward the riverbank, cutting off his escape route into the treacherous swamp areas, forcing him back into open ground. The lead trackers, relying on the clear, if unnerving trail E.L. had left, followed swiftly. But the moment they crossed the line of the bottomland, the environment began its work. The light dropped precipitously under the heavy canopy, and the temperature immediately felt 10 degrees cooler, the air thick and almost liquid with humidity. Visibility was reduced drastically by the layers of hanging moss and the pervasive green shade. The ground quickly became uncertain, shifting from hard earth to slick mud, often concealing deep sinkholes of stagnant water. Within the first 2 hours, the posse's structured advance began to falter. The horses became agitated and soon proved more of a liability than an asset, their hooves sinking into the muck. Deputy Thorne was forced to order the majority of the men to dismount and proceed on foot, slowing their pace dramatically. This was the first tactical victory for E.L. He had successfully neutralized the speed advantage of his pursuers simply by choosing his battleground. The first tangible losses were attributed to the environment, though skepticism was high even within the group. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Two of the men, both seasoned veterans of the chase, did not respond to the whistle call meant to check the perimeter. Their causes of disappearance were officially logged as accidents of terrain, though the lead tracker later confided in his journal fragment that the trails simply stopped in the mud, as though they were erased, not covered. The first flicker of true apprehension had begun to erode the posse's initial certainty. This slow erosion of confidence was punctuated by a pattern interrupt that fundamentally changed the nature of the pursuit. Around 3 o'clock, deep in the heart of the thicket, the remaining 21 men came across the first undeniable evidence of EL's preparation. Nailed crudely to an ancient cypress tree directly on the trail they were following was a neatly folded piece of cloth, the shirt EL had been wearing earlier that day. It was clean, and placed underneath it was a small, crudely etched piece of slate. The slate bore no message, no symbols of defiance, only the stark, perfect impression of a large, meticulously accurate map of the surrounding bayou system. Every major sinkhole, every hidden tributary, and every treacherous patch of quicksand was marked with chilling precision. It was in that humid, silent clearing that Deputy Thorne and his men realized the terrifying truth. They were not following a desperate man fleeing for his life. They were being led by a master tactician, drawing them deeper into a terrain he knew intimately, a terrain he had prepared and mapped long before the chase even began. The realization chilled the blood of the professional trackers. This was not an improvised escape. This was calculated design. They had walked directly into EL's complex, suffocating trap. The impossible stand had just begun. The pursuit had become the hunted. The morning of the second day found the pursuit deep within the unforgiving spine of the Texas brush country, a landscape that served less as backdrop and more as an active, hostile participant in the ensuing drama. Deputy Hickman, a man whose reputation was built on swift, brutal efficiency and an absolute certainty of capture, led his remaining contingent of 15 men. This was not a standard posse. They were hired hands, veterans of recent conflicts and hardened by the unforgiving nature of frontier requisition, men paid specifically to enforce the chattel system and the volatile, often lethal standards of justice that defined the territory in the late 1860s. Their equipment reflected their confidence: repeating rifles, ample ammunition, and the necessary tools of the trade, including the finest tracking hounds acquired from the Gulf Coast. In the historical ledgers of the ranch, the cost of the expedition was meticulously recorded, itemizing everything from sacks of hardtack to the replacement cost of any lost animal, a chilling juxtaposition of economic transaction against the human life they hunted. The initial hours were marked by swift movement, fueled by the deputy's belief that the fugitive, exhausted and untrained in military endurance, would soon break. He had, after all, only a few hours' lead and no immediate access to reliable water or supplies. The expectation was a quick roundup, a demonstration of the system's inevitability, but the certainty began to crack with the discovery that marked the close of the previous day, a discovery now being meticulously analyzed by the few men capable of genuine tracking. It was not the speed of the flight that was confounding, but the precision. They had followed a clear, purposeful trail for miles, only to have it vanish abruptly, not in error, but by design. The tracks ended at a patch of exposed shale, where the fugitive had evidently moved backward for several dozen yards, covering his own prints with deliberate care, before making a near-impossible leap across a dry wash that was rarely utilized even by local wildlife. This was the first genuine signal that their quarry was not merely fleeing the lash, he was conducting a tactical retreat. Deputy Hickman's official report to the county seat, dispatched by Ryder early that morning, mentioned only temporary delays due to unexpected terrain hazards. He avoided mentioning the growing unease among his men, or the silent refusal of the lead hound, Rex, to cross that dry wash. The animal, trained to the scent of fear and exhaustion, had simply sat down and whined, ignoring the handler's harsh commands. The second day plunged the posse deeper into the chaparral, a maze of mesquite and prickly pear cactus, where the dry earth swallowed sound, and the heat shimmered off the pale landscape in waves that distorted vision. The lack of water was compounded by the strategic silent emptying of the few waterholes known in the immediate vicinity, a fact the posse attributed initially to natural evaporation until one of the older, wiser trackers pointed out the faint but unmistakable pattern of deliberate contamination at two separate crucial sources. They were following a path that was not only treacherous, but actively hostile. By noon of the second day, 3 men had fallen out of the pursuit. 2 were attributed officially to heat stroke, their bodies found by the subsequent support riders collapsed near a patch of thorny brush. The third, a man named Silas, simply walked away, turning east toward the nearest settlement, citing a sudden fever that was suspiciously psychological in nature. The official count dwindled from 16 to 13, and yet there had been no direct engagement. The fugitive remained unseen, his presence manifested only by the meticulousness of the obstacles left behind. The pursuit morphed from a hunt into a relentless, suffocating march against an invisible enemy who clearly knew the territory better than the land itself. The man they pursued had spent 15 years working the edges of this unforgiving territory, marking its contours, observing its cycles, learning the precise location of every hidden crevice, every seasonal spring, and every naturally occurring trap. His knowledge was not academic, it was etched into his very survival. The evidence of his preparation, the unsettling pattern interrupt, continued to mount. The posse found small, carefully covered caches of water-bearing cactus pulp near areas they themselves had marked as dry. They encountered subtle trip hazards woven from strong vine and strategically placed to lead directly into clusters of razor-sharp Spanish dagger plants. These were not the desperate actions of an exhausted man. They were the calculated maneuvers of a patient, focused adversary, utilizing the environment as armor and weapon. Hickman, hardened but prideful, began to push his men harder, transforming the chase into a forced endurance test. His tone, recorded briefly in a surviving journal fragment of one of the trackers, shifted from arrogant certainty to mounting, frustrated paranoia. "He ain't running," Hickman is noted to have snapped during a heated argument over rationing. "He's testing us. He wants us to break our own necks." The terrain itself seemed to amplify the man's strategy. Dense, blinding dust clouds rose seemingly from nowhere, momentarily obscuring sightlines and disrupting communication. The pursuers were forced to rely less on their advanced weaponry and more on instincts honed by years of conflict, instincts that were now telling them they were exposed, vulnerable, and completely out of their depth. The tracking dogs, once the pride of the expedition, were becoming useless. They moved sluggishly, often refusing to take the lead, their powerful noses overwhelmed by a calculated cocktail of natural irritants, bitter herbs and ash that had been scattered deliberately across key junctions. It was a centuries-old tactic of resistance, perfected by those who needed to move invisibly through contested ground. The deputy's faith in technology and brute force was being systematically undermined by ingenuity and intimate knowledge of the wild. The sun beat down with relentless intensity. The psychological weight of the chase became almost unbearable. They were chasing a phantom, a ghost whose movements were perfect, whose strategy was flawless. They were constantly a few minutes behind, always finding the evidence of his presence. The embers of a fire still warm, a single footprint too deep in the dust, indicating a quick sprint, but never catching the man himself. This was the nature of the erosion of certainty in Act 2. The fear was insidious. It was not based on what they saw, but on what they failed to see. They were armed, mounted, and numerous, yet every man felt the tightening coil of vulnerability. They started sleeping in shifts, but the paranoia ensured little rest. They began to suspect even the most trusted members of the group, wondering aloud if the fugitive had somehow managed to leave false markers, diverting them deeper into the hostile territory. The most disturbing discovery occurred late in the afternoon of the second day, pushing the posse toward the precipice of collapse. They followed a new trail, one that seemed uncharacteristically clear and direct, leading into a narrow canyon choked with brushwood and boulders. It felt like a trap, yet the clarity of the tracks was too tempting to resist. Deputy Hickman, driven by mounting desperation, pressed the point. "If he wants a fight, we give him one," he declared, forcing the remaining 9 men into the canyon mouth. What they found inside was not the fugitive, but a carefully selected collection of items left behind. On a large, flat rock, exposed fully to the late afternoon sun, were laid out 3 distinct small piles. One contained the rusted manacles the fugitive had worn, another the tattered remnants of the shirt torn during the initial escape, and the third, and most unsettling, contained a single, small hand-carved piece of wood, an identifier perhaps, or a marker. Next to these items, carved deep into the smooth surface of the stone, was a symbol. It was crude, but recognizable to the few who understood the frontier culture, a marker used historically by indigenous groups to denote a kill zone or a place of final stand. It was a declaration of intent, a psychological weapon wielded with cold precision. The moment the men saw the carving and the meticulously placed personal effects, the entire nature of the pursuit shattered. The objects were not abandoned haphazardly. They were presented. They signaled not surrender, but the shedding of the very identity they sought to oppress. The fugitive was not running away from them. He was preparing for their arrival. The air grew heavy with a profound and terrifying realization. The deputy's voice, usually a booming instrument of authority, was reduced to a hoarse whisper as he stared at the tableau under the setting sun, the evidence laid out before them like a warning. It was then they understood. This was not a flight. It was a siege. And they had been lured deep inside it, miles from reinforcement, exhausted, demoralized, and confronted by an adversary who had not only prepared the battlefield, but had used the very geography of oppression as his tactical advantage. The man they sought to recapture had, in fact, turned the harsh Texas brush into an elaborate, silent kill box, designed to systematically dismantle them, not with brute force, but with patience and the suffocating pressure of absolute control. The roles had fundamentally reversed. The hunters were now the contained. The next hours would belong entirely to the architect of the trap. The relentless, suffocating humidity of the Texas bottomlands had, by the morning of the second full cycle of the pursuit, ceased to be merely an environmental factor and had become a psychological weapon wielded with expert precision against the heavily equipped posse. The air itself was thick, tasting of decay, stale water, and the metallic tang of fear that now clung to the uniforms of the remaining men. Deputy Hollis, a figure who only 24 hours earlier had exuded the unwavering confidence of institutional authority, now moved with a gait marked by irritation and a creeping internal doubt. His crisp uniform was irrevocably stained, saturated with the oils and particulates of the swamp, mirroring the deterioration of his command structure. The confidence that had defined Act 1 of the pursuit, the certainty that a single man, without conventional arms or logistical support, could only run in a straight line until exhausted, had utterly dissolved. That surety had been replaced by the chilling awareness that they were no longer setting the terms of engagement. They were merely reacting to conditions meticulously established by the fugitive, conditions that demonstrated an uncanny, almost preternatural understanding of military counter-tracking and ambush principles. The second wave of losses documented in the official reports of the time were not the clear, accidental fatalities of the first day. These new absences carried a distinct, terrifying ambiguity. When Sergeant Bell failed to report back from a perimeter sweep near a stagnant oxbow lake, and when three other men, Greer, Davis, and the young surveyor, hired for his knowledge of the less-traveled boundary lines, simply vanished between the hours of midnight and dawn, the remaining posse could not rationally attribute the fate of 5 men to mere accidents of terrain. The terrain was treacherous, yes, but these men were veterans of this territory. Hollis demanded an explanation from his remaining scouts. The response was a silent, sullen frustration. The evidence found was sparse, meticulous, and deeply unsettling. Where the fugitive had passed, there was no chaotic trail of desperate flight. Instead, investigators later noted patterns of movement that utilized water not just for cover, but as a mechanism for erasing time and distance. Hollis's men found tracks that led directly into deep, slow-moving bayou water, only to reappear miles away, far down current, contradicting the natural trajectory of a chase. The fugitive was traveling not just across the land, but through its temporal distortions. The specialized tracking hounds, whose ancestry was documented back to the most efficient manhunters of the Deep South, became the clearest indicator that the rules of the chase had fundamentally changed. These were animals trained to ignore pain, weather, and confusing scents in favor of human spoor. Yet time and again, during that second day, they reached specific, invisible boundaries where they would whine, pull back violently, and refuse to cross. When forced, they became useless, their focus broken, moving randomly or even retreating toward the established camp, shaking with a palpable animal panic that terrified their handlers more than any direct confrontation. What the dogs sensed, the men eventually understood. It was not the absence of the man they sought, but his calculated, unsettling presence. The remaining pursuers, now fewer than a dozen, began to experience what archival psychologists later termed forest psychosis, amplified by the oppressive environment. They walked hunched, their rifles often pointed toward high branches or behind them, reacting to every rustle of the thicket that was not wind. They started seeing fleeting shadows, a glimpse of dark skin against the impenetrable green, or the brief flash of light reflecting off a sharpened tool, just at the periphery of their vision, only for the image to resolve into a gnarled cypress knee or a thick cluster of Spanish moss. The greatest psychological strain came from the realization that the fugitive was utilizing their own logistical reliance against them. When they finally found the location where the main supply cache, placed days earlier and marked discreetly, was meant to have been secured, they found only a scene of surgical interference. The waterproof cloth protecting the rations was folded neatly beside the hollowed-out earth. Only the bare necessities had been removed. The small flask of medicinal spirits, a precisely measured quantity of jerky, and, most tellingly, 3 boxes of standard-issue percussion caps, the one item the posse assumed the fugitive could never acquire. This discovery shattered the last pretense of a simple chase. The fugitive was not merely running. He was actively managing the pursuit, using the posse as an inadvertent supply line, calculating exactly what he needed and what they would miss least, signaling not desperation, but control. Deputy Hollis, sweating profusely despite the failing sun, gathered the remaining men under the cover of a massive live oak, attempting to project an authority he no longer felt. His voice, usually a booming instrument of legal command, was raspy and low. "He is exhausting us. He is playing us like fools on a leash. We must push faster, cut him off before he reaches the river boundary." But the men did not look at the deputy. They looked into the deepening shadows, where the dense undergrowth promised concealment and delivered only dread. One of the scouts, a hardened man named Miller, who had chased fugitives for 2 decades, finally broke the professional silence that masked their fear. "Deputy," Miller whispered, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness, "there's no river boundary. The maps are wrong. He's running us back toward the big woods where no man goes in alive if he don't want to come out." This was the core realization of Act Two. The pursued was in fact the guide. The direction of the chase was not dictated by the deputy's intelligence or strategic planning, but by the will of the man they hunted. The fugitive was leading them deeper into a landscape that was hostile to their very method of existence, a territory where iron rifles rusted in hours, where the simplest wound festered into deadly illness overnight, and where navigation by compass was useless due to localized mineral interference. Hollis, clinging desperately to the framework of law and order that gave his authority meaning, refused to accept this strategic reversal. He insisted they press forward, despite the protests of the tracking team, who warned that the ground ahead was too spongy, too prone to sinkholes, disguised by thick layers of foliage. It was during this forced, late-night push that the second most devastating pattern interrupt occurred, cementing the shift from pursuit to entrapment. They were moving in a tight formation, their lamps casting inadequate pools of yellow light on the trail. A sudden, sharp sound, not the crack of a rifle, but the distinct, resonant thwack of wood striking flesh, followed by a muted, gurgling cry, came from the rear of the column. When Hollis and the remaining men spun around, shining their lamps frantically, they saw nothing but the shaking branches and the swirling insects drawn to the light. Corporal Jessup, who had been marching barely 2 paces behind the deputy, was gone. There was no sound of a struggle, no broken brush that suggested a fight, no residual footprint indicating a sudden lunge. Jessup had simply vanished, leaving behind only his rifle, which lay abandoned in the mud, its cold metal a testament to the suddenness of his disappearance. The men rushed back, searching frantically. They checked the ground for drag marks, the trees for signs of ascent, the nearby thicket for concealment. What they eventually found, embedded deep within the soft soil where Jessup had been standing, was a complex, interlocking pattern of small natural materials, twigs, mud, and crushed leaves, that suggested not a mere concealment of tracks, but an expertly constructed mechanism for sound absorption and misdirection. The spot where Jessup had stood had been specifically chosen, a shallow depression next to a small hidden culvert. The posse realized, with a wave of sickening clarity that washed over the entire group, that the fugitive was no longer waiting for them to catch up. He was circling back, operating unseen within the very perimeter they believed they controlled. It was the culmination of hours of psychological stress, the point where rationale finally surrendered to the primal realization of being prey. The missing men were not simply lost. They had been extracted, systematically and silently, by an unseen force whose mastery of the environment was absolute. This was the inflection point. It was no longer a pursuit. It was a siege, and they were deep within its suffocating walls. Deputy Hollis watched as the remaining discipline evaporated. 2 of the remaining men, without a word or a glance at the deputy, dropped their heavier packs and began retreating eastward, not back along the trail they had taken, but blindly through the swamp, choosing the known risk of immediate flight over the terrifying uncertainty of continuing the chase. Hollis raised his arm, momentarily intending to fire on the deserters, but his hand shook violently. He understood that shooting them would only confirm the absolute loss of his authority and incite total panic among those who remained. The pursuit officially ceased to be a law enforcement operation and devolved into a desperate mission of self-preservation. The men who remained with Hollis, now 7, including the deputy, did not move forward, but huddled together, backs against the great live oak, aiming their lanterns outward into the impenetrable darkness. They were surrounded by the sounds of the night, sounds that now carried a sinister, analytical quality. The distant hoot of an owl, the splash of unseen movement in the bayou, the scrape of something hard against bark. They were sounds that suggested not the random rhythm of nature, but the methodical reconnaissance of an opponent who knew every shadow, every echo, every blind spot of the forest floor. They began to scrutinize the environment they had previously ignored, searching for the evidence of the fugitives' intelligence. They found strange, meticulous markers on the underside of low-hanging branches, small cuts that were certainly not surveyor's marks, placed at varying heights, acting perhaps as a secret cipher or a map visible only to the man who placed them. They were utterly incomprehensible to Hollis, serving only to deepen the unsettling fact that the environment itself had been mapped, marked, and weaponized against them weeks, perhaps months, in advance. The extreme resistance demonstrated by the fugitive was not the spontaneous eruption of violence by a cornered man. It was, as the fragmented documentation later suggested, the execution of a meticulously prepared campaign, a testament to years of forced labor and multiple escape attempts that had transformed him from a victim of the system into an unparalleled strategist of wilderness warfare. He was fighting the system itself, using its arrogant assumptions about his capabilities, his perceived lack of formal military training, his assumed desperation, as his primary weapons. As the dense fog began to roll in with the pre-dawn chill, covering the remaining posse in a shroud that muffled sound and obscured vision completely, Deputy Hollis pulled a heavy silver watch from his pocket. He was acutely aware of the time. 36 hours had elapsed since the start of the pursuit. They had covered barely 20 miles, lost more than half their manpower, and consumed almost all their remaining ammunition in wild, stress-induced shots at imagined targets in the dark. Hollis knew, with chilling certainty, that the end of this impossible stand was approaching. But the terrifying question that hung in the mist, the question that would haunt his final documented moments, was simple. Would he meet the fugitive, or would he merely become the next statistic of the forest, absorbed silently, like Corporal Jessup, into the hostile, resisting earth? He realized they were waiting, trapped in the center of a strategy they could not comprehend, praying only for the first weak ray of dawn to pierce the oppressive canopy and somehow restore the illusion of safety. As the sun began its brutal ascent toward the 24th hour of the pursuit, the landscape of the arid Texas chaparral ceased to be merely a background. It became the final, decisive executioner. Captain Hollis, sweat dissolving the powder residue on his face, staggered along the rim of the dry arroyo, the last remaining vestige of his confidence evaporating with the morning mist. He was accompanied only by Sergeant Kincaid, whose rifle barrel now dragged uselessly in the dust, and Trooper Vance, who had stopped speaking 3 hours prior, consumed by the relentless heat and the deeper, chilling silence that followed every gunshot from the previous night. The system that had armed these men, that had given them the authority to hunt a fellow deputy whom they deemed a traitor to their corrupt brand of frontier justice, was built on the certainty of overwhelming force and technological superiority. But the deputy, whose name was now spoken only in panicked whispers, had spent the preceding 23 hours dismantling that certainty, piece by meticulous piece. They had begun with 19 men, well provisioned, carrying the explicit mandate of their jurisdiction. Now, at the 24-hour mark, they were 3, dehydrated, psychologically shattered, and profoundly lost in a maze of rock and mesquite that felt utterly alien. Though they had ridden these lands for decades, Hollis knew with a certainty that pierced through his exhaustion that the deputy was no longer fleeing. The shift had occurred somewhere around the 18th hour, documented by the chilling discovery of the carefully stacked weapons of 3 lost troopers, unfired, deliberately disabled, and left as an impossible marker on a lone ridge. It was not a flight path. It was a strategically executed clearance operation. They had been drawn deeper into the territory that the deputy had mastered years ago, a labyrinth of shifting sand and sun-baked stone where every vantage point, every shadow, belonged to him. Kincaid tripped over a thorny clump of prickly pear, his cry swallowed by the stillness. "He's gone, Captain. We lost him. It's over." Hollis did not acknowledge the plea for retreat. His focus was fixed on a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the sand, leading into a narrow wash, a perfect example of the deputy's deliberate psychological warfare, leaving a trail just clear enough to follow, but leading inevitably into a prepared trap. The final confrontation was not loud, nor was it protracted. The records, compiled 3 days later by the incoming state rangers sent to investigate the sudden silence, imply a moment of final absolute fatigue meeting strategic precision. The sun, refracting off the white stone of the canyon walls, blinded Kincaid and Vance simultaneously. Hollis, positioned slightly higher, saw a movement, not the deputy himself, but a carefully placed tripcord, taut and invisible against the rock face, designed not to wound, but to collapse the ground beneath them. The resulting rockfall was localized, massive, and final. It buried the 2 surviving troopers instantly, silencing the last remnants of the organized pursuit. Captain Hollis, standing above the wash, was spared the immediate impact, but what he witnessed in that split second of geological violence was the definitive, terrifying proof of the deputy's complete mastery over the environment. Hollis did not fire his pistol. The records show he walked several paces away from the scene, towards the highest point overlooking the vast, silent basin. There, he shed his heavy leather belt and sidearm. The official documentation of the scene, meticulously catalogued by Ranger Captain Elijah Thorne, stated simply that Hollis was found 2 days later, dead from exposure, sitting upright, facing the impenetrable horizon. His eyes were wide open, fixed on a single distant hawk circling high above the treacherous canyons. There was no sign of the deputy, only the profound, silent testimony of the land itself. The arrival of Captain Thorne and his company of rangers at the scene marked the true beginning of the investigation and the definitive closure of the loops left open by the 24-hour pursuit. The findings were staggering. Thorne's official report, filed with the state archives in Austin, focused entirely on the forensic geography of the chase. It wasn't a report of battle. It was a detailed study of tactical erosion. Thorne noted the methodical progression of the pursuer's demise, confirming that the deputy had engaged in what could only be described as textbook guerrilla warfare adapted entirely to the extreme terrain. The first 5 men, lost early on, were attributed in the original posse logs to accidents of terrain. Thorne's investigation revealed that these were not accidents. They had been led into areas destabilized by subtle hydrological diversion weeks prior, dry creek beds that turned into mud traps under minimal load, routes of ingress made treacherous by deliberately loosened scree. The equipment was perhaps the most telling evidence of the psychological siege. They found rifles, pristine and unfired, discarded not due to combat damage, but because the men had become too exhausted, too terrified, or too disoriented to carry them. Water canteens were found emptied and intentionally left behind, forcing the trackers to choose between conserving their strength and suffering potentially fatal dehydration, a deliberate calculation by the deputy who understood the precise limitations of the human body under the oppressive Texas sun. Thorne's men meticulously mapped the deputy's movements. They found evidence of pre-placed caches, not of weapons, but of water and dried jerky hidden deep in rock fissures, accessible only to someone with intimate, almost native knowledge of the region's topography. This shattered the initial premise that the deputy had simply fled. It revealed that the resistance was not improvised. It was planned with the foresight and precision of a military campaign. The 24-hour pursuit was merely the execution phase of a strategy laid down, potentially weeks before the catalytic event that triggered his stand. One crucial detail was documented in Thorne's appendix: small, almost artistic carvings found on the underside of specific granite overhangs, marks that were not trail markers, but indications of wind direction, shadow patterns, and optimal sound refraction points. These marks suggested a deep understanding of natural physics and strategic placement, ensuring that the deputy could hear the approach of the posse long before they could see him, utilizing the canyon echoes to mask his own movements, or crucially, to amplify his presence where he needed it least expected. Closing the central loop, how one man, potentially out of ammunition after the initial escape, managed to incapacitate an entire unit, Thorne's conclusion was unequivocal. The casualties were overwhelmingly non-ballistic. The deputy's strategy was not based on direct engagement, but on using the environment, dehydration, psychological stress, and sheer exhaustion to turn the pursuers' own advantages against them. He had used the weight of their own mandate, their arrogance in believing they knew the land better than he did, as their undoing. The land itself became the weapon. The subject did not physically eliminate the posse, Captain Thorne wrote in his concluding remarks. He systematically forced them into positions where the natural hostility of the territory, coupled with their own exhaustion and internal discord, rendered them obsolete. This was less a shootout and more a deliberate attrition until self-destruction. This revelation was the core of the impossibility. The deputy, utilizing years of brutal survival under the harsh historical reality of the Texas frontier, had transcended the simple role of a runaway. He had become an embodiment of resistance against an oppressive system that believed its reach was absolute. His stand was not an act of violence for violence's sake, but a demonstration that absolute authority could be countered by absolute knowledge and unwavering will. The fate of the deputy remained the final, powerful question mark, a testament to the success of his stand. He was never found. No body was recovered. No confirmed sighting was ever made by official sources, despite extensive searches in the weeks that followed. The official government records of the time struggled to categorize the event. Initial reports whispered of a large bandit raid or a sudden conflict with an unknown group of hostile natives, desperate attempts to rationalize the complete disappearance of a significant law enforcement body. However, the internal notes and anecdotal evidence preserved in local archives paint a different picture. The most widely accepted theory among the rangers themselves was that the deputy had successfully navigated the maze of canyons and found passage south, likely into Mexican territory or deeper into the uncharted wilderness that existed beyond established jurisdictions, a territory where the authority that had sought to oppress him held no sway. He vanished into the frontier, becoming a ghost story for the established order and a silent symbol for those who suffered under the often brutal, arbitrary nature of Reconstruction-era frontier justice. The impact of the 24-hour pursuit reverberated far beyond the dusty canyons of that single locale. The state implemented immediate, though reluctant, revisions to pursuit protocols, acknowledging, without ever officially stating, that the arrogance of reliance solely on manpower and firepower was fatal in the face of absolute resistance informed by superior knowledge of the environment. This story, like so many others of extreme resistance against overwhelming force in the historical context of the United States, whether against the inhumanity of the chattel slavery system, the brutality of land displacement, or the unjust legal systems of the frontier, was systematically minimized, distorted, and nearly erased from official history. It survived not in the meticulously bound volumes of government archives, but in the whispered legends of the local people, a chronicle passed down around campfires and behind closed doors. It represents not the glorification of conflict, but a profound and disturbing testimony to the resilience of the human spirit. It demonstrates how individuals, stripped of every legal and physical advantage, can leverage knowledge, environment, and sheer will to achieve the mathematically impossible when faced with a system that has fundamentally removed all other options for survival and dignity. The Texas deputy's impossible stand lasted only 24 hours, But the echo of his success, the silence left behind by the vanquished pursuers, remains a potent educational reminder of resistance documented in the very geography of the American West.